Imagine turning on your computer 5 years ago. You'd press the power button, stare at a bootloader menu, and make a choice that felt weirdly dramatic for something so mundane. Windows or Linux, work or play, stability or freedom, compatibility or control. It felt like picking a side in a quiet little war that had been going on for decades. Dual booting became a ritual, a compromise, almost a badge of honor for tech enthusiasts. You carved your drive into pieces, installed 2 operating systems, and lived with the friction. Reboot to switch worlds. Reboot to get that one app. Reboot to play that one game. Reboot just to print something. It was normal, but it was never elegant. Now fast forward to today, and something strange is happening. That old ritual is starting to feel unnecessary. The line between Windows and Linux isn't just blurring, it's dissolving. And for the first time, it feels like we might be watching the end of dual booting altogether. If you've been around long enough, you remember how separate these worlds used to be. Windows was the polished mainstream everything's just works platform. It ran the software people actually needed. It had drivers for everything. It was what schools, offices, and gamers used. Linux, on the other hand, was for the curious, the stubborn, the tinkerers. It was powerful, but rough. You spent hours configuring Wi-Fi, editing config files, compiling drivers, and praying your GPU didn't break after an update. You loved it, but it demanded patience. So most of us settled into a compromise. Linux for development and customization. Windows for the rest. 2 partitions. 2 lives. 1 machine. But something changed when Microsoft quietly started embracing Linux instead of fighting it. At first, nobody believed it. This was the same company that once called Linux a threat. Then suddenly, we got the Windows subsystem for Linux. Not a virtual machine, not a clunky emulator, a real Linux environment inside Windows. You could open a terminal and run Bash, apt, SSH, Python, Node, all natively. Developers who used to reboot into Ubuntu just to run a script now stayed in Windows. It felt like a small feature at first, almost experimental. But it was the first crack in the wall. Then WSL evolved. It wasn't just a compatibility layer anymore. It became a full Linux kernel running in a lightweight virtualized environment. Performance got faster. File system access improved. GUI apps started working. Suddenly you could run Linux desktop applications inside Windows. You could launch a Linux text editor, a Linux ID, even graphical tools, and they'd show up like normal Windows apps. No dual boot, no heavy virtual machine window, just there, seamless, almost invisible. And for a lot of people, that was the moment the question popped up. Why am I still dual booting? At the same time, Linux itself was changing just as dramatically. The Linux desktop stopped feeling like a hobby project. Distributions like Fedora, Ubuntu, and Arch polished their installers until they were almost boringly simple. You clicked next a few times, and everything worked. Drivers, automatic, updates, 1 button, gaming, surprisingly great. Thanks to Proton and Steam, thousands of Windows games ran on Linux, with almost no tweaking. Titles that once forced you back into Windows just launched like any native app. For the first time, you could realistically stay on Linux full-time, without constantly hitting walls. And then there's the browser. It sounds boring, but the browser quietly killed a huge reason for dual booting. So much software moved to the web that the operating system underneath started to matter less. Office tools, design tools, communication apps, project management, video editing, even development environments, all running in Chrome or Firefox. When half your day happens inside a browser tab, whether you're on Windows or Linux, starts to feel irrelevant. The OS becomes plumbing. Necessary, but invisible. But the real twist is that both sides started copying each other. Windows began adopting ideas that felt straight out of Linux. Package managers like Winged made installing apps feel like apt or Pac-Man. A proper terminal with tabs and customization replaced the old command prompt. Developer workflows that once belonged to Linux became first-class citizens. Containers, Docker, Git, SSH, all built in and officially supported. Meanwhile, Linux borrowed polish from Windows and Mac OS. Better hardware detection, friendlier installers, clean design languages, stable app stores, Flatpak and Snap making apps portable and easy. The experiences started to converge. If you're building software today, your workflow probably looks almost identical on both systems. You open VS Code, you run Git, you use Node or Python. You spin up Docker containers. Everything behaves the same. The commands are the same. The tools are the same. 5 years ago, that would have sounded impossible. Now, it's normal. And when your workflow is identical, the reason to maintain 2 separate operating systems disappears. Even gaming, the last stronghold of Windows, is no longer a guaranteed excuse. Proton has reached a point where many players install Linux, log into Steam, and just play. No hacks, no special tweaks. Anti-cheat support improved. Drivers from NVIDIA and AMD got better. Performance gaps shrank. Some games even run faster on Linux. The idea that you need Windows for gaming is slowly turning into a myth. And once gaming stops forcing you back, what's left that truly requires Windows? But here's where it gets really interesting. Instead of competing, Windows and Linux are now entangled. Windows literally ships with a Linux kernel component. Linux runs Windows apps through tools like Wine and Proton. Developers target cross-platform frameworks like Electron, Flutter, and WebTech that don't care what OS you're on. The walls aren't just thinner, they're full of doors. Think about what dual booting really was. It was a solution to incompatibility. 2 ecosystems that couldn't talk to each other. 2 sets of apps that refused to coexist. You had to choose at startup, because once you were inside one, the other might as well not exist. Now, you can run Linux tools inside Windows. You can run Windows games inside Linux. You can run most of your work in the cloud. The old incompatibility that justified dual booting is evaporating. And honestly, dual booting was always kind of a mess. Partitioning drives was risky. Updates could break bootloaders. Windows updates sometimes overwrote grub. Linux installs sometimes confused Windows. Data was split between partitions. You'd constantly wonder where you saved that file. On the Windows side, or the Linux side, sharing space felt clumsy. It worked, but it was never smooth. It was a hack we accepted because we had no better choice. Now the better choice might simply be one system that does everything. For some people, that's Windows with WSL. For others, it's Linux with Proton and Wine. Either way, the need to reboot is fading. And rebooting feels archaic in a world where everything else is instant. There's also the cloud factor. More development is happening on remote machines and containers. You SSH into a server. You open a browser-based IOD. Your local OS becomes a thin client. Whether it's Windows or Linux barely matters. It's just a window into something else. In that world, dual booting feels almost silly. Why juggle 2 local systems when your real work lives somewhere else entirely? What's funny is that this merging isn't some grand plan announced on a stage. It's happening quietly, piece by piece. A Linux kernel here. A compatibility layer there. A cross-platform app somewhere else. No dramatic headlines. Just gradual convergence. One day you wake up and realize you haven't rebooted into your other OS in months. Then a year. Then you start wondering why that second partition even exists. For long-time Linux users, this feels surreal. The dream used to be the year of the Linux desktop. Every year, we joked that it was finally happening. And every year it didn't. But maybe we were looking at it the wrong way. Maybe Linux didn't need to replace Windows. Maybe it just needed to seep into it. And that's exactly what happened. Instead of conquering Windows, Linux moved inside it. Now millions of developers use Linux daily, without even leaving Windows. That's not defeat. That's infiltration. And for Windows users, Linux isn't scary anymore. It's not this mysterious hacker OS. It's just a terminal you open to run commands. It's normal, familiar, useful. The cultural barrier disappeared. Once that fear went away, the technical barriers followed. So here we are, at this weird moment in computing history, where the 2 biggest desktop worlds aren't enemies anymore. They're overlapping circles in a Venn diagram that's almost a single shape. And when 2 systems overlap this much, maintaining both separately starts to feel redundant. Maybe dual booting won't vanish overnight. There will always be edge cases, specific enterprise tools, niche hardware, or personal preferences. But for the average developer, gamer, or student, The old reasons are fading fast. We're moving toward a future where your operating system isn't a hard boundary. It's just a base layer that can run everything. And maybe that's the real story. Not that Windows and Linux are literally merging into one product, but that the distinction between them matters less every year. The walls are gone. The ecosystems interoperate. The choice isn't dramatic anymore. It's just practical. So the next time you power on your PC and don't see that boot menu, don't be surprised. Don't miss it too much. That old dual boot screen was a symbol of division, of compromise, of either or. What we're getting instead is both. Both tools, both apps, both worlds at the same time. No reboot required. And honestly, after decades of juggling partitions and restarting just to open one program, that feels less like the end of something and more like a quiet, long overdue upgrade.